This event will be held by Ashley Smith here. He's going to sort of break down the wider context behind the recent Trump-Iran deal, or the dismantling of the Iran deal by Trump. And if you're not a foreign policy nerd like he is, maybe you can become one, because I'm not. So I hope to become one, and so he'll be helping you become one. And then after that, we'll have about an hour discussion, and then we'll wrap up, and then we'll go eat somewhere. Does that sound good for everyone? Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Not good for anyone? Perfect. All right. Well, without further ado, Ash.
Thanks, Cobalt. I wish I was speaking about a more happy thing after that video about socialism. But we are now on a much more dangerous path to regional war and potential confrontation in the coming years between the United States and Iran. And the trigger of this has been Trump's decision to rip up the nuclear accord that the Obama administration struck with Trump. And there's going to be many, many repercussions of this, not only in the Middle East, but also in Asia, and between the US, the European Union, the US and China, the US and Russia, that is sharpening antagonisms between the different states in the world system. And if people haven't been paying attention to the news today, Trump just canceled the summit with North Korea. So that is now off. So we're going to be back to the status quo ante of a war of words that is very scary between Kim Jong-un, who's the leader of North Korea, and I can't even, bring myself to say President of the United States, but Donald Trump, the biggest billionaire, the orange oligarch. So we're going to see more of that kind of war of words coming up. And this turn by Trump about Iran and North Korea is a taste of what we're going to see more of from the Trump administration. Because over the last year, he has had basically a faction fight in his administration between the Republican establishment and the generals on one side, and the Bannonite wing on the other side, between basically business as usual Republican policies, tax cuts for the rich, deregulation, give away corporate America, and people who are like protectionism and great power confrontation and war with Iran, war with North Korea. And what Trump just did is clean house of all the establishment people and bring in the most scary cabinet I think that you can imagine being in charge of the White House right now. They're extremists that he replaced all the establishment figures. And those people were like Tillerson, Cohn, and a couple of other people, McMaster, the general that he got rid of. And he replaced them with a cast of creeps. John Bolton, who was so extreme in the Bush administration, they had to keep him under wraps because he wanted massive regime change all around the world. Mike Pompeo as another figure that he's brought in. He's elevated a guy named Peter Navarro, who basically wants an economic war with China, and the torturer-in-chief of the CIA that just got approved by the Democrats, really, that gave her the margin of victory in the confirmation hearings, Gina Haspel. And so we've already seen the consequences of this turn in the Trump administration over the last year, over the last month, basically. A turn to hard protectionism, all sorts of sanctions, economic sanctions against economic competitors, great power confrontation, ratcheting up the rhetoric against China, and targeting of so-called rogue states, in particular Iran and North Korea. So with the ripping up of the Iran Accord, we're going to get a taste of more things to come. This is the beginning of a much nastier phase of the Trump administration. This is going to ramp up conflict in the Middle East, especially between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And given what he just did with North Korea, he's going to hyper-polarize the whole situation in Northeast Asia, which we've seen missile exchanges over Japan, etc. So it's a very disturbing development. So this situation, it's essential for the left to understand what's going on, to adopt the correct kind of positions on what's going on, and argue a completely different kind of politics that is available from most leftists and most liberals. And I'll lay out how we should position ourselves at the end of my talk. So Trump's first act in this kind of America First phase of his foreign policy was to rip up this nuclear accord, Obama's nuclear accord. And I just want to go through what that nuclear accord was, just to dissuade people of any kind of nostalgia for the Obama administration and thinking that was a great thing and Trump has ripped up a great thing. In reality, the nuclear accord was part of an imperial strategy that the US had vis-a-vis Iran. So it wasn't a pacifist thing, it wasn't a nonviolent thing, it didn't come with all sorts of strings attached and threats of war with it. It came with all of those things. So the accord was struck between Iran on one side, the US, Britain, France, and Russia and Germany on the other side. So the 5 members of the UN, the 4 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. So it's the 5+1 agreement. That was the nuclear accord. It offered to drop some sanctions that the US and the European Union had imposed on Iran for a long, long time in exchange for a freeze on its nuclear development program. Trump, Israel, and Saudi Arabia claimed that Iran had violated the strictures of that accord. So that was his justification for nixing it. But the Trump administration and Israel, which doctored all sorts of evidence, are basically lying. The International Weapons Inspector and Nuclear Development Monitoring Group, the International Agency, International Atomic Energy Agency, has repeatedly verified that Iran is in full compliance with the nuclear accord. So this is just lies from the Trump administration. So despite the lies which you can expect from Trump, the U.S. has withdrawn from the accord and is ramping up sanctions on Iran, reimposing all the sanctions that were dropped after the nuclear accord was struck. Moreover, he's threatening all countries that have trade relations and investments in Iran with sanctions on them if they don't heal and obey what Trump is saying. So he's threatening sanctions on the European Union for their investments. So this is a big upsetting of the apple cart of the historic North Atlantic Treaty Alliance between the US and the key players in the European Union. He's doing the same kind of threats of sanctions against China and Russia, who have big investments in Iran. So this is a big inter-imperial dynamic that we're seeing develop. So it's not only about Iran, it's about the behavior of the European Union and the behavior of Russia and China. So this is great power politics at stake in all of this. Now, we should have no illusion in Obama's original nuclear accord. He didn't strike it, as I said, out of some kind of pacifist instinct. Remember, during the run-up to his election and his first term in office, he said that all options were on the table. That is, he had imposed sanctions, and he had actually threatened military strikes on Iran. So his diplomatic resolution of the conflict with Iran was driven by threats of warfare. So we shouldn't think that Obama was some great guy who was a pacifist and he's been replaced by a hyper-militarist Trump. As we know from Obama's drone war, he was just as militarist as any other American president has been in the history of American imperialism. So what he did is, why did he strike the accord to begin with? It was really part of his reorientation of American imperialism away from the Middle East and out of ground wars in the Middle East, so he could reposition America's military might against China in Asia. So he wanted to deploy, through what he called the pivot to Asia, 60% of the American Navy away from the Middle East to Asia to contain and confront China as a rising imperial rival. So it's the exact opposite of any kind of anti-war. In fact, it's ratcheting up what he was trying to do, tensions with China through direct military might, imposing that in Asia, as well as the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and trying to get all the countries of Asia on side with the US versus China. So that was really his motive. So his bet was that if you strike the nuclear accord with Iran, the US would be able to balance between the existing states in the Middle East, balance between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, the main antagonistic states, along with other states in the region like Turkey. So he thought the accord would enable him to withdraw those forces and reorient American imperialism. He also thought the accord would keep in check Iran's relative rise as a regional power. And that he would be able to balance between all the different states. At the same time, he wanted the nuclear accord. Why? Because it would preserve the American and Israeli nuclear monopoly in the Middle East. That is, Israel has tons of nuclear arms and missiles. It's the only nuclear power with that kind of weapon capacity in the Middle East, and the US hangs over the entire Middle East with its massive cruise missiles and battleships that have, and submarines that all have nuclear warheads. So they're very concerned to maintain their monopoly on nuclear warheads. So that's the exact opposite of an anti-military kind of thing. So the US is not dropping its nuclear weaponry. In fact, under Obama, and now even more under Trump, they're ramping up the nuclear capacity of the US state. So with the Middle East stabilized, he hoped in that way you could pivot to Asia. But in fact, Obama's administration failed on both fronts. Instead of being able to withdraw from the Middle East, with the rise of ISIS, the US has had under Obama and under Trump a more intense intervention into both Syria and Iraq. Not in Syria against the Assad regime, but very narrowly against ISIS, because the US really wasn't interested in regime change in Syria. They were mainly focused on destroying ISIS as a threat to the state stability of the entire region. So he failed in terms of a reorientation of American imperialism out of the Middle East. He also failed in his pivot to Asia. He wasn't able to send the military hardware, especially the Navy, to Asia. Couldn't get the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement passed, and China has been establishing economic relations and political relations with countries throughout Asia. So his strategy has failed. That gave an opening to Trump to figure out a different strategy, this kind of America First strategy that I briefly summarized at the beginning. So he's ripped up the accord in order to reorient American imperialism to confront these, quote, rogue states, Iran, North Korea, and also the great powers, especially China for him, but also Russia. So what's the real reason that Trump is doing this? It has nothing to do at all with the threat of a nuclear program in Iran or its weaponization of that nuclear program on missiles. It has everything to do with the relative decline of American might in the Middle East and the relative rise of Iran as a regional power. That's the real thing that's going on. How did Iran rise as a regional power? You have to go back to what the Bush administration wanted to do back in 2003 with the Iraq War. The idea was intervene in Iraq, install a puppet government, and then conduct rolling regime change throughout the entire Middle East and lock the Middle East under the dominance of the United States so that it could control the strategic oil reserves. And if you control those oil reserves, you control every economy on the planet. So it was a plan to lock in American dominance in the world system. Obviously, that blew up in Bush's face. He lost the war in Iraq, he lost the war in Afghanistan, and a general called it the biggest strategic defeat in American history. So it was an enormous setback for US imperialism in the region, and it set back open space for other powers to become increasingly assertive in the strategic center of the world economy over the battle over the control of its oil reserves. So we saw Iran emerge from the Iraq War as the unintended victor of the war. An enemy regime in Afghanistan was toppled by Bush. Iran was happy about that. The Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein was toppled. Iran was happy about that. Even more so, the new regime that came into power had an alliance with the United States. So you have this weird situation. The new Iraqi government that the US intervention installed was a Shia fundamentalist regime allied to both the United States and Iran. So Iran's got a new ally as an unintended consequence of the Iraq War. So Iran could add Iraq to its network of alliances. It has a on again, off again relationship with Hamas in Palestine, and it successfully defended the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad that was faced with a massive revolutionary uprising as part of the Arab Spring back in 2011, and Russia and Iran sent massive forces to defeat that revolution and help Assad drown it in blood. So Iran mobilized Shia fundamentalist militias from Lebanon, Hezbollah, to go into Iran to supply the ground forces that had disappeared as a result of the crack-up of the Syrian army. And Russia intervened with its air power, effectively helping the Assad regime bomb and kill the revolution and that's where it's really at. So now you've got Iran with a regime in Syria allied to it, Iraq allied to it, an on-again, off-again relationship with Hamas and its key ally in Lebanon, Hezbollah. So it rose as a potential new regional power, and that was the real reason that Trump decided something different had to be done vis-a-vis Iran. So what? That's why he ripped up the accord. Now, the plan that Trump has is to sanction Iran, just like the U.S. sanctioned for over a decade the Iraqi government, to try and strangle it, weaken it, undermine its economy, so that then the U.S. could conduct a regime change. And when you think about the flashback regime that we now have in Washington, D.C., of all these neocon regime change hawks, that's their battle plan. Bolton just last year was at a meeting of this right-wing regime change Iranian organization and says, this is a fantastic meeting, next year we'll meet in Tehran and you'll be in power. This is last year. So the guy who's at the heart as the national security advisor of the foreign policy is a regime change hawk. Pompeo is the same kind of guy. So this is a path to war that I don't think is going to come soon, but that's the dynamic of the situation. So this is a real threat with these regime change hawks in power. Iran has reacted as you would predict, by condemning the United States and promising to uphold the nuclear accord if the European Union, Russia, and China stay on board with the nuclear accord. And just a few words about the Iranian regime, because it is in tough shape right now. And this is part of Trump's calculation, that there's a big and growing internal opposition to the regime in the form of mass protests that happened in December and January, actually calling for the downfall of the regime by working class people, poor people, feminist organizations who are outraged about conditions there. And the conditions are really terrible, because when Iran struck the nuclear accord, their hope was get rid of some of the sanctions, have massive investment come into the economy, you can get the economy growing again, do something about unemployment, and mollify the increasing anger that's been developing from working class and oppressed people in Iran. Now, what has happened is the economy has improved a little bit, but only for the bosses. And there's been very little trickle down, as there never is in a capitalist country, to the workers and oppressed people who want a better deal in society. And so the Rouhani regime in Iran got caught in a contradiction. It raised people's expectations of better social conditions because of the accord with the United States, but then got poor results. And so this contradiction amplified the anger in the society and provoked this wave of mass protest in December, and now a strike wave that most people don't know anything about, but there's a strike wave ripping through Iran right now, of teachers, all sorts of workers that are striking about the same kind of issues that teachers are striking about here in the United States. Bad wages, old textbooks, poor working conditions, the same kind of dynamics. So in this circumstance, and now faced with a real threat and fear of regime change, the Rouhani administration, and especially the Iranian hardliners in the ruling class, are trying to divert all that class anger into nationalism against the United States. So the hardliners organized a wave of protests throughout Iran in opposition to Trump nixing the nuclear accord. And their hope is to then convince people not to strike, not to demonstrate against the regime, because that would give an opening to the United States to come in and overthrow the regime and impose what people in Iran fear is the return of the kind of Shah monarchy that the U.S. was allied to through most of the 20th century. So that's their hope. And the other side of it is that they're beginning to condemn the domestic movement of workers and poor people as a color revolution orchestrated by the United States, that these people are dupes of American imperialism. So they're using nationalism to hopefully deflect people's class anger and demonizing the resistance movement of working class and poor people within the country as a cat's paw for American imperialism. So that's the dynamic inside of Iran. So they're whipping up nationalist fervor to confront the United States. And there are other regional dynamics that are starting to happen and happen immediately after Trump's decision, because there's a similar dynamic of war fever and nationalism that's being whipped up by other regimes in the region, most importantly Israel and Saudi Arabia, which are the most hawkish of the rival powers to Iran in the Middle East. So Trump basically, through this decision of ripping up the nuclear accord, gave a green light for Saudi Arabia and Israel to attack Iran through its proxy conflicts with Iran in Syria and Yemen. So Israel reacted immediately. Is that 10 minutes left? Is that what you're saying? Good. I'm doing great. Israel reacted immediately, as we know. So Israel took as an alibi a series of rocket launches that came from Syria from Iranian bases towards Israel, and Israel responded by a wave of missile strikes on every military installation that Iran has built in Syria, because Israel fears that Iran is developing a base of operations that's a threat to Israel in Israel's dominance and control of the Golan Heights, which is occupied territory in Syria. And Trump, at the very same time, made another decision that further gave a green light to Israel, and that's moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, to occupy Jerusalem on occupied Palestinian land. And that decision was taken, and the New York, I forget, it was the New York Post and the New York Daily News, they had the best headline about the moving of the embassy and the celebration with Ivanka and Jared there at the scene of the slaughter. They had an image of Ivanka giving a victory, a congratulations speech at the moving of the embassy, and on one side, and the other side, a scene of what Israel conducted at the very same time. It's a massacre of hundreds and hundreds of people, nonviolent protesters, Gandhian-style protesters, trying to protest and win the right to return and cross the wall into occupied Palestinian land. And so the New York Daily News, or whatever it was, they had these pictures coincided, and they had a picture of the slogan over Ivanka Trump was Daddy's Little Ghoul, which really captures Ivanka Trump in a nutshell. So, but it's not only Israel that's ramped up their militarism, as you would expect, against Iran in Syria, but also against Palestinians. The other power is Saudi Arabia, which took also Trump's decision about ripping up the nuclear accord as an excuse to intensify its carpet bombing in Yemen, which it's been doing with American support, political and military and economic, to bomb the crap out of the Houthi rebel forces which are allied to Iran. So another wave of missile strikes and helicopter gunships were launched out of this. So Trump has thus really intensified the regional conflict in the Middle East between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And the most disturbing thing is Netanyahu, the Trumpite president of the state of Israel, is on record wanting a war with Iran. So this guy outdoes Trump in terms of military madness. And Saudi Arabia similarly wants to take Iran down as a threat, not over religious anything. This is about regional power, capitalist power, who dominates the Middle East, who controls the oil reserves of the Middle East. So Trump's decision has also intensified the U.S. conflict with American allies and rivals. So he's snubbed the European Union, most embarrassingly Emmanuel Macron, who came to Washington, D.C. and suffered the dandruff scandal. Did people see what he did? So Trump and Macron were doing some kind of press conference, and Trump saw a little piece of dandruff on Macron and made this melodramatic gesture to wipe the dandruff clean. That's basically what Trump did to the entire union. The European Union, humiliate them as just having dandruff problems because they were all begging him to stay in the nuclear accord. And he was like, screw you. So all the leaders of the European Union are outraged, from Merkel in Germany to Macron in France to the head of the European Union, Juncker, who are all pissed off because of that snub, but even more so the threat of sanctions against them for having investments in Iran. And you're talking about not tiny investments. Like France has a contract for 100 Airbus airplanes in France. You're talking about billions of dollars. This is not petty cash. This is a major investment. So Trump wants them to end that contract, not ship the things, and he's threatening sanctions against them. But, and this is where the inter-imperial dynamic is very interesting, already the European Union countries, Britain, France, and Germany have told Trump that they're going to stay in the accord and that they're arguing against his imposition of sanctions. So this is a big break in the relationship strategically between allies that have been locked together since World War II. So what is Trump going to do? Is he going to sanction them? We don't really know. Russia and China will no doubt either defy or find some kind of way around the sanctions that Trump is trying to impose. Why? Because they're determined to increase their weight in the Middle East. In particular, Russia is concerned to capitalize on its victory in the counter-revolutionary destruction of the Syrian population to extend its influence to the other countries of the Middle East, all about controlling the oil. So this is great power politics by Russia. And China really wants relationships with all the countries of the Middle East because it's utterly dependent on the Middle East for all its natural gas and oil. So Trump's decision on Iran has also destabilized Asia. And this is totally unsurprising because you have Trump before the decision on Iran in the North Korea summit saying two totally different things about two key theaters. In Iran, he was like, I'm going to rip up this accord, it's not stringent enough, we need to screw Iran over, force its total denuclearization, rip up its, and then when he wants to have a summit with North Korea and say, let's strike a deal and work it out. This is utterly incoherent. So if you're in North Korea, why would you trust anything that Trump is saying when you look at what he's doing in Iran? If anything, it's going to increase your determination to build a nuclear warhead and further develop your missile capacity to launch missiles in self-defense against an aggressive imperialist power coming at you, which you know the entire cabinet is stuffed with regime change hawks who want regime change not only in Iran, but also in North Korea. So unsurprisingly, we've had this comic sequence of events that ended up with the cancellation of the North Korean summit as a direct result of the nixing of the Iran accord. So Trump is now in this absurd situation where he had already nominated and given himself the Nobel Peace Prize for the summit that's now canceled. So like, how is this summit canceled? When you think about it, it's really a bizarre story. So the negotiations were already going bad because they were sending Pompeo, who's for regime change, in North Korea to negotiate with North Korea about the plans for the summit. So you look at the negotiating positions, the US position under Trump was immediate end of its entire nuclear program, the destruction of its nuclear missile capacity, and on the other side, North Korea is like, well, we've worked out this deal with South Korea, and we're for a gradual transition that will take place over several years. So you have polar opposites being coming before the summit, with North Korea rightly suspicious of everything the Trump administration is doing. And then the trigger for the cancellation of the summit was the idiot Vice President Mike Pence yesterday on some right-wing talk show said that, well, you know, Kim Jong-un may just end up like Muammar Gaddafi. And like, Muammar Gaddafi, who was a horrible dictator that nobody, I'm not particularly upset that he died because he was a horrible oppressor of the Libyan population. But if you're going into a summit with Kim Jong-un and you're threatening him not only with regime change but murder, you're not going to have a very friendly summit. So yesterday, in reaction to Pence's statements, Kim Jong-un called Pence, ignorant and stupid, absolutely correct descriptions of Mike Pence, and a political dummy. And Trump, the ever-sensitive soul, you've been following the Twitter scandal where he's blocking everybody who's criticizing him on Twitter, and now there's a federal lawsuit where it's illegal for him to do that because it's part of the public sphere, and everybody should have freedom of speech and right to debate. So anyway, Kim says this about Pence, and Trump goes on a Twitter rant and says, well, the summit's off because you've insulted my vice president, and so then he's canceled the summit. So now we've got the status quo ante in North Korea of Kim Jong-un in a rhetorical battle with the orange oligarch in Washington, D.C., both of them with nuclear missiles, with the U.S. the biggest monopoly, and the U.S. occupying South Korea with a massive military force. So we're back to a very scary situation that's directly connected to what happened in the Middle East. And what I want to say is, with all the rhetoric about rogue state, this really proves that the United States is the biggest rogue state on the planet. Not a little pipsqueak like North Korea or a tiny little power like Iran. The U.S. is the biggest threat to world peace on our planet today. Final couple of points. So what should we do as the left? I'm going to go 5 minutes more because this is important. The left must understand and explain and position itself and guide anti-war activists to get this whole situation right, because there's a lot of mistakes that are available to be made. The first thing is we have to return to first principles about what's going on. What is driving this madness? It's not really a product of the Trump administration. He's a lunatic. End of discussion. But it's not just Trump. There are deeper motives that are driving the behavior of the U.S. state. That's why I spent the time going back and looking at what Obama did, because Obama was just as much an imperialist, just as much a hawk, just as willing to use America's military might as Trump was, maybe in a kinder, saner, more rationally thought through manner, but just as deadly. You know, as you follow the drone war, you very much know that. So the deeper causes of this behavior is the capitalist system itself that shapes the behavior and policies of all governments. And there can be variation in which policy people adopt, but there's deeper motives. Essentially, the system drives states to compete with one another over the division and redivision of the world system. Who gets the resources, who gets the cheap labor, who gets the spheres of influence, who's able to make the most profits out of the world system. So inter-imperial rivalry of the kind we're seeing between the United States and China and Russia is built into the system. It's not a result of changes in governmental policy. That is what's behind Trump's America First foreign policy and his reckless ripping up of the nuclear accord with Iran and his cancellation of the summit with North Korea. He's driven by these deep motives, and he's got to deal with the fact that the U.S. is not able to dictate terms in the Middle East, and it's got real rivals in the world system. So that's one axis of it. The other axis of it is the system is failing humanity all across the world, and it's provoking another dynamic, which is an international dynamic of struggle from below against the regimes throughout the world system. So I talked about the strikes in Iran. We've got the teacher strikes here in the United States. You've got tremendous discontent and working class anger throughout Europe, Latin America, Asia, you name the corner of the world system, and you have developing levels of anger around the class inequalities of our entire world system. And then you have the struggle of oppressed nations like the Kurds, like Palestinians, like Puerto Ricans, who are fighting for their democratic rights. So you have both conflict at the powers, between the powers at the top of our society, and struggle from below of an international character throughout the world system. So given these first principles, how should we position ourselves in this very frightening situation that we've entered? First, we have to avoid 2 mistakes. The first mistake we have to avoid is a liberal position that harkens back to Obama's deal as somehow a better thing that we should support. I think that's deeply wrong. As I've laid out, Obama's deal was an imperialist one to redeploy the United States to confront China and protect the U.S. and Israel's nuclear monopoly in the Middle East. So in the sense then, diplomacy and militarism are 2 sides of the same coin. because the US, like all states, builds a big military so it can be a bully in negotiations diplomatically. So diplomacy is war by nonviolent means. War is diplomacy by violent means. They're two sides of the same coin, and they're inseparable, one from the other. So we should have no illusions in multilateral diplomacy. Obama's kinder, gentler face than Trump, or whatever it may be. So that's why we shouldn't support the nuclear accord. We should oppose what Trump is doing and oppose the return to the nuclear accord, because that included a ton of sanctions that were immiserating the Iranian population. The second trap that we have to avoid is the trap of the campus left, of basically deciding any enemy of the United States is a friend of ours, which is a disastrous methodology which much of the left adopted in Syria. They were like, the US is doing bad things in Syria, therefore I'm in support of Assad's brutal dictatorship and his counter-revolution against the Syrian revolution and the people of Syria. Not only did a whole bunch of the left say that about Assad's dictatorship, they supported Russian imperialism's military intervention into Syria, Iran's intervention into the ground war in Syria, as well as China. That is disastrously wrong as a methodology, because what you're doing is building solidarity with another ruling class and its state, not with the indigenous working class that's fighting for liberation and national liberation struggle. So it's a disastrous betrayal of the principle of international solidarity. So we have to reject both these positions and adopt a third kind of approach. We must, based on those first principles, we have to oppose Trump's imperialism, his ripping up the Iran Accord, his escalation of the conflict in the Middle East and in Northeast Asia over North Korea. We shouldn't support Obama's accord, nor should we support other imperial rivals or regional powers like Iran. We should support, who should we support then? We should instead build solidarity with the struggles from below, the national liberation struggles like those of Palestinians, the Puerto Rican movement, the Kurdish movement throughout the Middle East, as well as the growing mass class struggle that's developing in Iran. Our bonds of solidarity should be with those national liberation struggles and the indigenous revolt, because that's the only way we're going to build an international force capable of ripping up capitalism, which is the font of the problem of imperialism. That's where it's born, created, and driven. So until we build the kind of international solidaristic movement against both the immediate threat and as part of a long-term goal of a whole new kind of society, we're not going to get rid of war in our world. So the solution is international socialism. I was thinking about the discussion because during the Iraq War, anti-war movement, that's what everybody talked about, was international politics. Talked about the war in Iraq, learned everything about the history of Iraq, learned how to make the arguments against sanctions, knew the arguments about the Democratic Party, that they were not friends of the anti-war movement. And the radicalization that we've gone through over the last few years is mainly focused on domestic politics. The inequalities of our society, the injustices. There's very little discussion about the international side of the capitalist system. And I think this is a weak point, because the question of imperialism and what the US state does abroad is now inseparable from what the US state does at home. And if we're ignorant about what it does abroad, we're going to weaken our domestic struggle. Because you think, the US spends, what, $650 billion a year on the US military. That's a big chunk of change that could go to housing, wages, jobs program, free public education for all at every level, free health care for all at every level, $650 billion. That's not even talking about taxing the rich, which then you could have peace on earth and goodwill to all human beings. But like there's a huge amount of the American state that is invested in maintaining its rule and domination of the planet. So I think that one of the things that we have to internalize, especially among the newer comrades and activists, is to understand that there are two axes of conflict in the capitalist system. There's an axis of conflict within each and every nation state that's capitalist between the ruling class, the working class, and the oppressed. That's one antagonism between the people who rule and the people who are oppressed. And then there's another antagonism between the capitalist class and its state and other capitalist classes and their states. And those two things are wedded together. They're part and parcel of a whole system. That means we have, and now imperialism is back. You have to know how to respond to these debates, because they're going to come up everywhere. What do you say about what's going on in Gaza? What do you, because the U.S., without U.S. support, Israel wouldn't be able to do this. So what do you say about all those arguments? What do you say about sanctions on Iran? What do you say about the nuclear deal? What do you say about Trump's foreign policy in vis-a-vis Iran? You've got to know something about that. You got to know theory, you got to know history, and you've got to be able to make those arguments in a popular, common sense way. And so that's the skills that people who've mainly developed around radicalization around domestic questions have to develop about international questions. Because if we don't, we're international socialists. We're not national socialists. That's the Nazis, right? We're international socialists because we want a whole world system that's socialist. So you can't win that in one country. So internationalism and a kind of anti-imperialism is absolutely essential. So on the question of US imperialism and the methodological questions, I just want to reiterate the two big dangers and then our third position. The biggest danger in the United States is I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, blah, blah, blah. Standing for the national anthem, blah, blah, blah. Trump has just forced all the football players on paying of penalties, of fines, that they have to stand and respectfully listen to the national anthem, which is racist, nationalist, xenophobic, pro-imperialist garbage at the heart of a big part of American capitalism called the American National Football League. That's an international question at the heart of the national sport, which is the most brutal sport, and any decent society would be banned, frankly, because it's a toxic, dangerous sport, not only ideologically, but for the people who play the game. It would be reformed to touch football and I could play it. That would be my kind of fantasy. So the biggest danger in the United States among radicals is liberalism, is social patriotism, is allegiance to the American state. The American state is our oppressor. It's not our state, it's their state. And that's one thing, there's no we in America except working class people. And working class people in the United States have more in common with working class people in Iran than the American ruling class and the American state. So that we has got to end. The we that we're about is internationalism, not a we with our exploiters and oppressors. That's the biggest danger, is social patriotism, allegiance to our own oppressor's state. The second danger is allegiance to other oppressors' states. Not to the workers of those countries, but to the states and the ruling class that owns that state, allegiance to those. That's also a violation of international solidarity, because you're not actually building international solidarity. You're building an allegiance to another state that's oppressing and exploiting working class people. In the case of Iran, Russia, China, the European Union, whatever. A bunch of liberals are now pledging allegiance to France and Germany and saying Macron is a great guy. Macron is a thug. He's a neoliberal pig and a racist. And you can't, it's a sign of the decay of the American liberal left that they're fantasy island about Macron. It's just terrible. So we have no allegiance to our state, we have no allegiance to other imperial states and other oppressive states like the Iranian one. That methodology is very important. We have anti-imperialist internationalism. That's the bedrock of how we approach these kind of questions. Then the question of the Democratic Party becomes absolutely essential, because so far the discussion about the Democratic Party has been about, can we take it over, and thinking about it in terms of domestic politics. We have to learn something about what the Democratic Party actually is in terms of world politics. It has been the main imperialist party of American capitalism. It started World War I, World War II, Vietnam. Where does the regime change policy come from? From Bill Clinton's administration. He passed the Iraq Liberation Act that made the overthrow of Saddam Hussein the official policy of the US state. So Bush is like, yeah, I agree, 9/11 happened, we can go and do it. So who paved the way for Bush's war in Iraq was Bill Clinton and Al Gore. One thing about the Democratic Party that I have to state, if people have never watched Madeleine Albright being interviewed by Leslie Stahl, you should really watch this video. So under the Clinton-Gore administration, they imposed these sanctions on Iraq that, as Paul said, killed 500,000 kids in Iraq. And this became a big international struggle against the sanctions on Iraq, which is very important for us thinking about the sanctions that are about to happen even more intensely on Iran. And the ISO helped organize a big campaign, and we had a full one-page ad in the New York Times with thousands of people who signed on to the campaign against the sanctions. So it became a scandal under the Clinton administration. And so Leslie Stahl, who's a big-time CBS journalist, interviewed Madeleine Albright on live TV and asked her, you know, US sanctions have killed 500,000 kids in Iraq. What do you think about that? And she said, well, that's a price I'm willing to pay. That's the Democratic Party. It was worth it to weaken the regime of Saddam Hussein. That's the Democratic Party. We have to internalize that so that we're immune to this lesser evil fantasy land, or that we can take this monstrosity over. It's a monstrosity, and it is responsible for mass slaughter internationally through the course of the 20th century. But compared to Trump, it looks pretty good. You know, that's the big danger. You put anybody next to Trump and they look like an angel. I mean, you can be the torturer, mass murderer next to Trump and really even look good. So that's a real problem, and that raises the question of what Trump is up to, and how much of the capitalist class supports what he's up to. He is doing something very different, and what Nolan just said is absolutely right, that he is ending the kind of multilateralism. He is ending the kind of alliance structure of the US state with other imperialist states like the European Union's constitutive states. And he is whipping up great power conflict with China and Russia, and a unilateralist, interventionist use of the American military and diplomacy. That's what he's doing. And it's a big break, especially the protectionism. It's a big break with everything that's gone on. The question is how much of the capitalist class supports him. The capitalist class loved the Trump administration for its first year. They got everything they wanted. It was a smash and grab operation. So Apple liked tax cuts. They may have liberal qualms about it, but they're making gazillions of dollars. I mean, they're raking it in. Every single corporation liked it because of the amount of money they make. They don't like his protectionism. On the whole, I would say 75% of the American capitalist class doesn't like his protectionism, doesn't like what he's just done with Iran. That, you know, like one of the Obama administration apparatchiks wrote a big opinions piece in the New York Times, and she said what Trump just did to the international system was, through the Iran cord being ripped up, was sending a wrecking ball through the world system. So they don't like it at all. But there is a problem, is that their business as usual policies that they've been following up until Trump have failed. The US is a declining imperial power. Still the biggest, greatest enemy of people on earth, but it's a declining power and it faces a real rival with China, which is beginning to compete at every level and is militarily more assertive in especially the South and East China Seas than we've seen from any power against the United States in a long time. So the strategy of business as usual is failing. And that's where Trump has come up with his America First solution. But we shouldn't say that this is just a crackpot. He is a crackpot, but it's not just a crackpot strategy. It's an attempt to solve a real problem, and there's a sector of the American capitalist class that is with him in doing this stuff. I mean, if you look at the billionaires in the Trump administration still now, and they're supporting this protectionism. And on some places, the Democrats actually agree with this stuff. So if you look at what Chuck Schumer said about sanctions on China, he's actually to the right of Trump on sanctions on China. So around China, there's more of an agreement around protectionist threats to force them, from the Democrats' point of view, to behave in the international system. From Trump's point of view, he's on the road to a major war with China. So there are differences there, but it's surprising how much slippage there is in this direction. Final point is, so far I've talked, and most of the discussion has been about this axis of conflict between the states of the world system. The other axis that we have to remember is in each and every country since 2008, we've seen mass uprisings against the states and against the ruling classes of most nation states of the world system. It's actually been the biggest, least organized wave of struggle since the 1960s. Some of the biggest demonstrations in each and every country they've ever seen. Some of the biggest shifts in politics from the right to the left. If you look at the pink wave in Latin America, huge shift to the left. Or if you look at the Arab Spring, I mean, people don't even know anything about it anymore because it's been drowned in blood. But every regime in the Middle East was threatened with a mass popular revolution. And there's been strike waves all over the world. And so our hope is that we're opposed to our state. We don't align ourselves with any other state because all states are capitalist now and they all exploit and oppress the peoples of every single country. Our allegiance is to that international movement of working class and oppressed people and oppressed nations fighting for their own liberation. And that is alive in Iran. Like there was an article in the Alliance for Middle Eastern Socialists, which everybody should read, that Frida Afari wrote that was entitled, "What Can American Teachers Learn from Striking Iranian Teachers?" That's our politics. We have no allegiance to the oppressive states. We have allegiance to Iranian workers who are fighting for a better deal. And we hope they have allegiance to us as American workers fighting for a better deal against our own exploiters and our oppressors. And if you want to learn more about all this stuff, you've got to come to Socialism 2018, because we're going to have Middle Eastern socialists. We're going to have Iranian socialists. We're going to have Latin American socialists. We're going to have Quebec socialists. We're going to have European socialists. We're going to have socialists from Asia, where we're debating and discussing a real world question now that is imposed on the entire radicalization, that our struggle is not just in the United States. Our struggle is a genuine international struggle of the workers of the world, which we've got to unite, as Karl Marx said a long time ago.